Hi, welcome to another episode of the Caroline Glick Mideast News Hour. This week, I have the real pleasure to talk to my friend and colleague. He's in Washington. His name is Cameron Khansarinia. He's the head of the National Union for Democracy in Iran. And the reason that I turned to Cameron this week to talk is because while we were thinking about other things, the Iranian people have once again taken to the streets of their country to demand freedom and the overthrow of the regime. And this time, like almost every other time that we've seen for the past 40 years, when the Iranian people go into the streets and voice their disaffection with the regime, nobody is paying attention to them. So I think with the IAEA, hi, Cameron. So with the IAEA reporting, finally, hello, that Iran has crossed the nuclear threshold and putting out this condemnation of Iran, which may in 5 or 7 or 12 years turn into something really important at the UN Security Council. I think that we really need to take a look at what's happening on the ground. So without further ado, Cameron, can we just start walking through why are they rioting in the streets today, or demonstrating in the streets more precisely? What precipitated this latest round of demonstrations? How widespread are they? Just take it away.
Sure. Well, first of all, Karen, thank you again for having me back. It was a pleasure to be with you for the first time in person here in Washington, and great to be with you virtually. Hope to see you again in person.
And by the way, before you begin, let's not forget. So everybody who just started watching this show since I moved it to JNS last month, Cameron was on one of the early episodes of the Caroline Glick Mideast News Hour when I was at the Center for Security Policy, where I'm a senior fellow last summer. And when we were talking last summer, we were in a similar mode where there were demonstrations all over Iran. And then they kind of died down and everybody forgot about them. And Biden went on with his nuclear kabuki theater of pretending that he's about to get a deal that's going to really do something to stop Iran from becoming a nuclear power. And here we go. So take it away, Cameron. I'm not going to interrupt you again.
No, please. That's my pleasure. Host prerogative. But as you say, right now, I think probably one of the most critical things you said in your introduction is that the Iranian people are in the streets once again. Every time these protests pop up, these demonstrations pop up, I think many people who are analyzing this, be they journalists, analysts, whomever in the West, Iran watchers, tend to look at these as sporadic or disconnected events. But the phrase you used once again is important, because this protest movement that we're seeing right now in Iran is just the latest iteration of an ongoing anti-regime movement that can probably be traced back its roots to the 2016-2017 time period, when a new generation of young Iranian activists came onto the streets. This is after what the world knew of the Green Revolution, the Green Movement in 2009, when Neda Agha Sultan, that young protester, she was shot in the middle of the streets and sort of became an international icon for democracy. That was a previous, not quite generation, that was a previous movement, and now we're in a different phase. And the critical difference in this most recent phase of protests is that, as opposed to previous things that protesters were calling for, which were perhaps some level of reform of the Islamic Republic, some civic rights, for example, let's say more social freedoms for women, relaxed political environment, now it's very clearly a movement that is focused at the entirety and the very basis of the Islamic Republic. And all you have to do to realize that, as you have so precisely in your writings and your past shows on this topic, is listen to the chants of the Iranian people. I mean, they're not talking about getting their vote back. They're not talking about some small reforms here or there. Their chants are very clear: death to the supreme leader, down with the Islamic Republic. We did this revolution. What a mistake we made. And sometimes getting even more political, calling for a certain political system or the return of the monarchy, whatever. It's a very diverse political atmosphere in Iran. But what is clear is that they are unquestionably against this regime and calling for its overthrow. So that's what's happening right now. The reason that this most recent sort of spout of protests began was much like the November 2019 protests, which unfortunately led to the Aban massacre, which you and I talked about last time, just the brutal slaughter of at least 1,500, probably upwards of thousands of people on the streets of Iran in a matter of 3 days under an internet blackout. This was also started by—
When was that again?
That was November 2019. And that was when the regime shut off the internet and literally, basically mounted military-grade weapons on tanks, cars, and were mowing people down in the streets because Khamenei, the supreme leader, there is leaked information from his office saying that he thought the regime was in trouble, serious trouble of collapsing, and he ordered his generals to take action, and they unfortunately did. Like that protest movement, this one is also initiated by, or sort of the spark is lit by, economic concerns with the overnight increases in prices on most basic goods, bread, pasta. We're not even talking about things like chicken or meat anymore, because for so many Iranians, Iran, which used to be even a relatively economically secure country in the Middle East, things like meat are now a luxury for even members of the middle class. That's how bad the economic situation has become because of the Islamic Republic. So these most recent protests were once again sparked by economic considerations, but very quickly the protest chants were focused on the supreme leader and on the entirety of the Islamic Republic, calling for its overthrow.
Well, weren't the initial? I mean, I know that it's about inflation and food crisis and water crisis and all these kinds of things, but wasn't it also the collapse of the apartment building in Abadan?
Exactly right.
So what
exactly
happened there
right.
exactly? When was that?
Yeah, so that was about 2 or 3 weeks ago at this point. You're right. It was a building called the Metropole in Abadan, which was not even fully constructed, was not fully filled with its occupants. But as usual, the Islamic Republic took no care to properly build buildings. I mean, the most basic things like building codes that we in the United States, in Israel, in Europe, and throughout the Middle East take as a granted are things that the Islamic Republic just doesn't care about. And once again, it's showing its utter lack of care for even its own citizens. And so this building collapsed. Dozens of people were killed, even children. Many numbers of them. There are these just devastating photographs of little girls' shoes or a teddy bear just amongst the rubble. And what really infuriated people and caused the massive protest movement in Abadan that then also spread to other parts of the country was not just the fact that the regime has such lack of care for its citizens that it allowed a building like this to be built and then crumble. But as soon as the building crumbled, because the country is in such a state where everything quickly becomes political, the regime knew this. And before even sending search and rescue to pull little babies and little kids out of the rubble, they sent anti-riot police. They sent security forces to crush any potential protesters, literally while there were people still suffocating under the collapsed concrete.
I heard that they didn't actually send in rescue crews.
Later they did, days later, but citizens—
Days later, they sent in rescue crews?
Yeah, citizens had to take this on themselves, effectively. Because when the government was not there, when they used their resources to send anti-riot police, effectively SWAT teams to crush any potential dissent from the people of Abadan. As you say, there was no search and rescue sent. Citizens had to take this up themselves, and people were literally bringing their family dogs to try and act as search and rescue dogs to help people. And so that was actually, of course, it should never have gotten to that situation. Any responsible government sends people, search and rescue teams to save their citizens. But of course, this regime, no one has any such expectation of that. But it was actually an impressive sign of solidarity from Iranians in the aftermath of this. Of course, it never should have come to this. It's a devastating tragedy. But they showed a real impressive amount of unity. I mean, people from other provinces coming to help the people of Abadan in other cities throughout that province and other provinces. You saw protests in solidarity with the mourners in Abadan and their chants on the streets of, Abadan, we're with you. Abadan, we're united.
Yeah, I saw some crazy footage that was of a soccer game, and the fans in the soccer stadium were chanting Abadan, Abadan, Abadan.
Exactly. Even in Tehran, even in the capital, Tehran, this happened all over the country. And it's events like this that I think, even for parts of the population that are not necessarily those who are on the streets every day, let's say the middle, upper middle class, even upper classes, this refocuses things for them as well and says, wow, hey, I may not be extremely poor, I may not be part of the protesting class, but it makes me think again that I'm going to go to my apartment building tomorrow or my office building, because it's also built by the Islamic Republic, that may collapse. I may lose my kids, I may lose my wife, my husband. So these sort of tragedies have a way of refocusing, I think, Iranians' attention on the main source of the problem, which is the Islamic Republic. And you mentioned in a previous question, inflation, water, food prices, this building. Previously, I think you would have seen protests just about water or just about inflation, or just about this building. What Iranians have now realized, I think, is that all of those problems and the other problems they face have one main factor behind them, and that is the existence of this regime itself. You can't just solve the water problem. You can't just solve the inflation problem. You have to solve the main problem, which is the existence of this very regime.
That's actually a good question, which is, take the water problem for a second. Right? Listen, the Isfahan dam has basically just dried up, and there's no water in that city. Oops, Isfahan, sorry, you guys thirsty? Yeah. Whatever, tough luck. But so has the regime done anything? When were the Isfahan water shortages were going on, like in 2018 or something like that? I mean, is there water there now? Have they fixed it?
No. And I think there's two reasons for that. The first of which is they don't want to. The second of which is they can't. They don't have the technical ability to do so. And I'll sort of go briefly about each. For the first of which is they don't want to. And this is, I think, this often sounds, when I talk to my friends here in America or in Europe or across the region, sometimes they think I'm exaggerating and they think this sounds crazy. But I think Iranians' everyday lived experience proves this to be true, which is this regime really doesn't care about Iranians. I mean, it doesn't care that there's no water. As long as its leading clerics and its IRGC commanders are fat and happy, and I mean that quite literally, fat and happy, that's all they care about. And there's a speech, in fact, from one of the leading clerics in the regime saying, the people of Iran need to learn from the people of Yemen, who are surviving and resisting eating dirt and grass. I mean, that's the vision they have for the Iranian people. A country with 2,500 years of really grand civilization, they want to reduce it to a population that's resisting eating grass and dirt. So they don't really care that people in Esfahan, as you say, don't have water. And even if they did, they're so incapable of fixing these problems because of their anti-Western, anti-American ideology that prevents them from working with the people who could fix this. We often talk about this here at NUFDI and with other of our friends. I mean, we imagine in Iran, without this regime, that's just a regular country, a secular democracy. Where's the first place that Iranian environmentalists and water experts will look to help? It's to Israel. I mean, the amazing progress that Israel has made in whether it's water desalination, whether it's just, providing a remarkable water security to a desert country. I mean, Iranians look at that and say, why can't we do the same thing in our country? Why aren't we partnering with Israeli scientists and technologists to do this? But of course, the Islamic Republic's ideology, which doesn't even recognize the state of Israel and wants to wipe it off the map, prevents them from doing so. Those are things that frustrate people when they see the solutions there and their government refuses to do anything about it.
No, you were talking about fat and happy, and that really does bring us to the regime, which is, in the Soviet Union, they had the nomenclatura, which were the people who were like in the regime apparatchiks, the ones who got the jobs. They were members of the Communist Party. Their children were taken care of. They got to go to the fancy schools, everything from nursery up through the university system. And they lived, by Soviet standards, they lived a pretty good, pretty high quality of life. They were comfortable. They had cars and other things. When you talk about the regime, how large is it? Like, who are you talking about? Are you talking about a small cluster at the top? Are you talking about a very large cross-section of Iranians who are in various arms of the regime, whether it's the civil service or the security services. I mean, who are you talking about, and how happy are they? I mean, are they cut off from the rest of their country the way that the Soviet apparatchiks were? Or do they live among their people? And are they, permeable to the cries of the Iranians? How do you look at the circles of fat and happy? How wide are they? How powerful are they? And how insular are they?
Excellent question. And I think that this circle has been shrinking over time. I think that for a long time, let's say from the post-war period, the post-Iran-Iraq war period, the 90s, the 2000s, and so that circle was probably relatively large. You have several categories of people that you mentioned: the armed forces, the security forces, those working in the civil service. Because even at that time, even though Iran was still under international sanctions, they weren't to this extent of sanctions. And to be frank, a lot of the infrastructure that was developed in the country prior to the Islamic Republic, be that human infrastructure and human resources, I mean, the civil servants doing this work, to the actual physical infrastructure, that was continuing to carry the country forward to some. It was almost on autopilot to an extent. Of course, the regime did its damnedest to harm that, but the country was still survivable, had a relatively large, compared to many countries in the Middle East at the time, middle class. People were somewhat comfortable. So people with some connection to the government, again, be they in the civil service or elsewhere, were relatively happy. But as the regime's, I think, incompetence, as its ideology has formed, taken over more and more parts of the economy, more and more parts of the country, it's now able to take care of fewer numbers of those people. So you now see a significant percentage or significant numbers of even those directly affiliated with the regime, again, be they low to middle level civil servants, low to middle level members of the armed forces, and a critical, I guess, point we always have to make when talking about Iran and the armed forces is, as you well know, Caroline, the Iranian armed forces are not like most armed forces where you have a national military force. It's divided between Iran's Atesh, which is your standard military armed forces, and the IRGC, which everyone knows about, and many people here in Washington have spent the better part of the last year in ways that boggle the mind, lobbying to get that terrorist entity removed from the U.S. Foreign terrorist organization list. But those two are separate because the IRGC is focused purely on the defense of the regime. I mean, the word Iran is not even in its title. It's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. They're there to guard the Islamic Revolution. So there are all these concentric circles of people who were benefiting from the regime. But as the economic mismanagement has grown so much, even significant levels of the armed forces in the traditional Atesh, who were always considerably less funded than the IRGC, they're disenchanted with this regime. Their needs are not being met financially or otherwise. And even growing numbers of the IRGC, they're sort of low to middle rank officers and conscripts, their financial needs are not being met. So that circle is growing smaller and smaller. And to your question of how insulated they are, I think they're quite insulated because they don't live amongst regular Iranians. They are not forced to wait in food lines like most Iranians are. In fact, many of them, aside from the person, generally the man, obviously serving that government position, his wife and kids and cousins, they're not even often in Iran. They're living in $1 million homes in Canada, on the French Riviera, in posh London apartments. So they're so insulated that they don't see. And if they are in Iran, they're in the most exclusive elite of neighborhoods where they don't even interact with everyday Iranians. So that circle is shrinking by the day. And that actually provides, I think, much hope for change, because what Iranians are worried about, obviously, in any regime collapse, regime change scenario, is lack of central control and chaos. So when you have more members of the civil service, more members of the armed forces realizing, hey, this regime is never going to meet our needs, and they start to move towards a scenario where they would be able to turn their backs on the regime, it provides some assurances to the Iranian population that, okay, we will have state control. There will not be chaos when this regime collapses. So it's continuing to shrink by the day, I would say.
Let me ask you, I don't want to spend too much time on it because it's a little bit off topic, but you mentioned something that I find interesting, which is the issue of the Iranians living abroad and particularly in the West, who are actually tied to the regime itself and to the IRGC. And we've seen, the Iranian lobbying arm in the regime's lobbying arm in Washington in the United States is NIAC. And what does that stand for? The National Iranian American Council.
Mhm.
And they've already been proven to operate in coalition or at the behest of the Iranian regime. But when you look at the Iranian communities in the United States and in Canada, maybe in Germany and in other countries, what I don't know if you can quantify it, but how significant percentage of those communities do you think are comprised of people who are the dependents and or otherwise affiliated with the regime?
I think it's difficult to put a number on it. Indeed, the majority, at least the independently conducting polling that's done, let's say, on the Iranian American community, says that the vast majority, because very often they're people who have fled this regime for a variety of reasons. So by and large, that community is wholeheartedly against this regime. Their number one issue when it comes to U.S. foreign policy is promoting human rights and democracy. That's what the polling says. But there's a significant number, less so in the United States, thankfully, both as a matter of just pure morality, and second as a matter of security. There are few of those individuals here in the United States. But Canada has a significant population of people. Western Europe, a significant population, and it has multiple threats. The first of which is these people are bringing immense amounts of cash. If you look at cities like Toronto, for example, you see, just an immense amount of dirty money coming from the Islamic Republic and their affiliates in places like Toronto, London, the south of France. So not only is there that economic consideration, which one has to ask, is this money somehow evading sanctions? Are there legal things to be pursued there? I know there are some individuals who are working on projects, for example, to hold these people accountable. If their money is stolen from the Iranian people, how can that be confiscated from them? For example, with things like the Magnitsky Act or others. But there's this, I can't give you a percentage number of people, but if you look at dollar amounts, it's billions, if not tens or hundreds of billions, that is making its way out of the country, dirty money, and these people are living very posh lives across Western Europe and Canada, and even to an extent here in the United States.
So when you think about the nature of the regime, I also understand that since Raisi became president of Iran, which I think also was like around the same time that we had our podcast together last summer, so around a year ago, if I'm not mistaken, until now, the regime has officially executed somewhere in the neighborhood of 320 people, and that, of course, is the official numbers. So, this is a government that kills around one person a day on an official basis. That's a pretty stark number. Do you have any sense of how many people have been executed over the past year? How accurate that is, or how would you even quantify the numbers? How many people are imprisoned?
Oh, that number is probably accurate. It's probably on the low end, I would say, but it's probably roughly accurate. And luckily, there are Iranian and Iranian-American human rights groups who keep really good tallies of these sort of things. Some of them are based here in Washington, D.C., the Burman Foundation, the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center, for example. So people are tracking this, and we don't only have to rely, of course, on the regime's official numbers.
Okay.
What they'll often do is just make up reasons for these executions so that they can say, hey, this person was executed for murder or something, when in fact that was not really the case. They'll often, say that, for example, members of the LGBTQ community that they execute, they will say that they were arrested for rape when these allegations are completely false. So they do fudge the data in ways like that. For example, lying about the reason for the execution when everyone knows the real reason. But beyond that, beyond the actual executions, is the general state of fear that the regime attempts to force Iranians to live under, and that's I suppose the nature of a totalitarian state, which is not only making you fearful of being executed, but making you fearful that every little action, even in your private lives, even in the privacy of your home, can subject you to state violence. There's a recent example of an Iranian writer and activist inside the country, Hossein Ronavi. He wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal last August, just after you and I spoke. And he said, look, I'm writing this piece from inside Iran, and if this results in me being jailed, then so be it. It's worth it. And lo and behold, several weeks to months later, he was arrested, not only for writing that piece, but one of the charges that he was given, and he writes about this in a second op-ed that he has, is alcohol, is having 4 bottles of beer or wine or something like that. I mean, totalitarian states make you fearful about what kind of beverages you drink in the privacy of your own home. And so that's how they attempt to enforce a state of fear on the Iranian population for even the smallest of things. But what's been interesting in these most recent protests that we've seen is that it appears, to me at least, that to some extent, the Iranian people's fear has sort of dissipated. They're less fearful than they were several months ago, even a year or two ago, when we had the Aban massacre. People are sort of reaching their wits' end, if I could put it that way, and saying that, look, if we want to live free, if we want to get rid of this regime, we're going to go for it. We're not going to be held back by this fear. So that's something interesting, I think, that we'll all have to continue to watch, and which is why programs like this are so valuable. And I thank you for giving me the time to discuss it, because what Iranians often say, and Hossein wrote about this in his Wall Street Journal piece, was, look, people often lie to the Western media, this Iran lobby that you mentioned, say, no, don't talk about human rights, don't talk about the people of Iran, that will put them in danger, that will make it seem like a Western conspiracy. What they really want is as many people as possible talking about it, because when the attention is on them, when the spotlight of the world is on them, that puts pressure on the regime to not be able to act as viciously as it would. Of course, you can never control this regime entirely as long as it's in power. But international pressure, international attention, media attention is so critical because it puts the spotlight where the regime doesn't want the spotlight put. And so that's very critical.
It just reminds me, I've never been able to get it out of my head. Several years ago, the song, Pharrell Williams song, Happy, because I'm right? So I don't know, my family loves it. We used to dance to it when my boys were little. It's like our song. And I don't know how many years ago, maybe 5, there was a group of young Iranians who just lip synced it, and they were dancing, and they went up on the rooftops, and they were in a garden, and they were in somebody's apartment, and it was just, they were having fun. They put together this music video of them dancing and singing Pharrell Williams' song, and then like 2 days later they were all under arrest. And for singing a song and having a good time with their friends. I mean, they weren't, the girls and the boys, they were there together, but they weren't getting down and doing dirty things. They were just singing a song and having fun, and they were such nice looking young people, and they got arrested for it.
Not only were they arrested, they were later dragged, if memory serves, in front of state TV cameras to apologize, to give forced confessions. Like you said, for singing a song. And last year, I was just talking about, liquor and booze. Last year in Iran, there was somebody literally executed for drinking alcohol. Somebody's executed for drinking alcohol, young kids arrested for dancing. And this is, a lot of Iranians reference this. They think that, Margaret Atwood's book, The Handmaid's Tale is some fantasy or something. But in fact, that was actually written partially based on Atwood's, what she saw in the Islamic Republic. And that continues to this day. That continues in many aspects, whether it's for women, whether it's for young people. I mean, this society that this regime has tried to create is just forces people, again, in those private areas of their lives, whether it's even singing a song, to be scared. And that's something that I think is discounted in the Western media, that people forget, that they somehow think that, again, whether it's because of the propaganda of the regime itself or its lobby in the West, that this is just a normal government. They don't really like us that much. We got to be able to work with them. It's not a normal government. A normal government doesn't execute people for drinking, or, like you say, arrest kids for singing a song. It's not normal, and you can't you can't arrive at some conclusion or some resolution with people like this. It's just impossible.
Well, I mean, and that really brings us to the second part of what I wanted to talk about with you today, which is Iran's nefarious role in the world. That I started in my opening talking about the International Atomic Energy Agency of the UN that came out last week and said, yeah, Iran has crossed the nuclear threshold. They've mastered the nuclear enrichment cycle, and an Israeli security source made headlines last week saying that Iran has enough enriched uranium to produce 3 bombs. And then everybody says, oh, but it'll take them anywhere between 6 months and 2 years to use this fissile material to make bombs. Well, that's a relief, because all of us will be, obviously old and gray and in our graves, and so will our children and grandchildren in 6 months, right? So we've got nothing to worry about. I mean, the world is basically going to end in 3 weeks anyway, if you listen to AOC about global warming, right? So I mean, it's these crazy things, and and then you look, there's no water in Isfahan. There's no food on the table. And this blasé kind of, oh, Iran just crossed the nuclear threshold. And you realize, and this is to me what's so alarming and really terrifying, which is that this is a regime that over the past decade, Tzvia Chazkeli, a very excellent Arab and Islamic world correspondent in Israel, he did a piece on Iran on TV, and he said that over the past decade, Iran has spent $60 billion on terrorism and its nuclear program, and nothing on the Iranian people, essentially, right? They wait days to try to save people in a building that's collapsed on top of them. And it reminds me of a very terrifying thing that Rafsanjani said back in the 1990s, where he said about Iran's nuclear weapons program. He said, versus Israel. He said, well, he called Israel a 1-bomb state, that, all you need is 1 bomb to obliterate the Jewish state. But with Iran, if they attack Iran with nuclear weapons, yeah, they'll kill, the population, but we're part of the larger Islamic world and they're not going to get them. And that statement is really, first of all, it's obviously a declaration of, this is our priority. We, just as you said, it's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, not the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. They don't care about Iran. Iran is a base of operations for the Islamic Revolution worldwide. And when they say death to America, death to Israel, this isn't a slogan. This is a plan of action. And they're using all of their resources to advance this goal, both, with nuclear weapons, with terrorism, with terror armies throughout the Middle East. And, like you said, the Iranian people, they tell them to eat dirt and grass. So, when you look at what they're doing at home and you see where their priorities are in terms of the exporting the revolution abroad at all costs, at the cost of the starvation of their people, you have to wonder what people are thinking at the IAEA, at the UN Security Council, and of course, first and foremost in Washington, the great Satan. How do you look at that? What is the reception that you guys get from people in the Biden administration, in the mainstream media, and on the left, when you talk about them killing gays, and when you talk about, the human rights abuses and how widespread they are? I mean, does it register? Do people care?
Unfortunately, no. But before I talk about that, the point you make is so critical about the nature of this regime, about, for example, Rafsanjani's quote, the fact that death to America, death to Israel are not slogans, but they're strategies, they're policies for this regime. This is another thing which I think is consistently either misunderstood or ignored in the West, whether that's policymakers here in Washington, whether that's the sort of the bureaucrats jetting around on private planes throughout Europe, trying to get the Islamic Republic to the negotiating table, either they don't understand, or they are ignoring the fact that this regime's goal or its aims are not the best interest of Iran. That's the first mistake. I think that the Obama policy, now the Biden policy, was guided by this notion that, look, we will sit down with these people. At the end of the day, they'll negotiate for the best interests of the Iranian people and the Iranian nation. When very clearly the founders, the leaders of this regime have over and over said that Iran's best interest is not their aim. It's not even one of their top aims. Their aim, as you said, is the spread of the Islamic Revolution. Sudur Enqilab, the spread of the Islamic Revolution, is in fact a principle in the Islamic Republic's constitution. When Khomeini was asked, I believe in an interview or perhaps in a speech, about patriotism, he said patriotism is another word for Satanism. It's another word for devil worshiping. We only care about Islam and the Islamic Revolution and their perverted notion of this religion and its revolution. That's what they care about. You put it very well, that Iran for them is a basis of operation to spread this revolution. It's not their country. They couldn't care less about Iran or the Iranian people, much less. And so that they look at their own compatriots and their own country that way should give and treat them in this way should really be, I think, eye-opening for the rest of the world. That, okay, if they're going to treat their own people this way, how will they treat us? How will they treat others? So that's what's missing, I think, in so much of the strategy guiding policy towards the Islamic Republic, is a fundamental lack of understanding of the nature of this regime, of its aims, and what it believes in. This, again, either they don't understand or they don't want to understand it, and they're ignoring it. And as a result of that, either lack of understanding or refusal to understand, when we talk, whether it's with the Biden administration, in the meetings that we have had since we've requested multiple times, for example, as an Iranian American organization, we're all American citizens. We all live in this country. We're voters. We're taxpayers. Rob Malley, the special envoy for Iran, has refused to meet with us. He's been in the position for more than a year, refused to meet with us. We hosted a conference here in February where we had two former U.S. special envoys for Iran, Brian Hook and Elliot Abrams, former State Department spokesperson, Morgan Ortega's leading presidential envoys and Iran policy leaders. No one from this administration showed up. No one accepted the invitation. I mean, they just don't want to, they refuse to look at these issues as they are, because in our opinion, they are almost religiously obsessed and dedicated to this notion of the JCPOA, which is, back in 2015 was not a great deal. And now, when most of its terms are expiring, is an even worse deal. So they really don't understand it. And it, unfortunately, both in the policy world and in the mainstream media to which you allude, there's a real hypocrisy. And to be honest, in Hussein's second piece in the Wall Street Journal, which I hope folks will read who are watching us today, I would really urge them to especially read that second piece. It is very frank and says, look, Democrats, we're tired of you talking down to us. We're tired of you telling us Iranians who live inside this country, us Iranian Americans who are abroad, what this regime is like and what is best for Iran and what this regime will do. We don't need a lesson from the Democratic Party or from folks who think that negotiations are the best route. People inside Iran have been living with this regime for 43 years. I would venture that they know this regime better than Rob Malley and the sycophants that he has chosen to surround himself with, because we've seen that even Democrats, even people who are left-leaning, have resigned effectively in protest from Rob Malley's team, but they refuse to see the truth. So unfortunately, policymakers here in Washington or this current administration, again, either don't get it or just don't want to get it.
It's so funny, right? Because they act like they care about human rights. And they keep talking about racism and fighting racism and being for saving the climate and the environment and all of the rest of it. And here you have a country that isn't only racist, it's genocidal. You have a country that is oppressing all of its minority groups, including the Arabs. It oppresses everybody. It oppresses the Baha'is, it oppresses the Jews, it oppresses the the Azeris and the Baluchis, and I mean, you name it, they oppress everybody on the basis of race, on the basis of religion, on the basis, of course, sex. on the basis of sexual preference or all of their hot button issues. Everything. Iran's got it, and then they got the terrorism and they got the nuclear proliferation. I mean, there's nothing that they don't have that these people are supposed to be opposed to. And yet they're doing everything that they can to empower this regime against their own people. And, last week on a show, I was talking to my colleague and friend, who I'm sure David Wormser, and we were talking about the connection really between the inability of the Biden administration, and to a degree as well the current Israeli government, with Iran, because they're so busy undermining their societies at home, and they have such little regard for their own societies that they can't understand the evil that lurks beyond their borders, and that the Iranian threat keeps growing while they're sending their hordes out to protest and threaten Supreme Court justices in their homes. So I mean, it's like everything, you want to just talk about one issue, but every time that you try to talk about this one issue, about the fact that the Iranian people have been in open revolt against their government because they want freedom, and the same government that is pursuing nuclear weapons and sponsoring terrorism all over the world is oppressing them and murdering them and starving them and making them die of thirst and all the rest of it. And then you can't, because you're stuck also talking about possible overthrowing of Roe v. Wade and what's happening with Black Lives Matter. And I mean, it's like, you can't just talk about one thing, because everything you go back and you say, well, you have these governments that just don't even care about their own countries.
What we've often said here at NUFDI, we tried, I think, actually Israel policy in Israel for a long time set an important precedent in the United States of looking to allies on both sides of the aisle and having a bipartisan, which of course that's changed recently with so many people, anti-Israel voices in the Democratic Party, unfortunately. But that's a similar approach that we've tried to take at NUFDI, because we fundamentally view the Islamic Republic as a threat to obviously the region and the American allies in the region, but to the United States and to U.S. national security. And for that reason, it should be something that both Republicans and Democrats care about. But even more specifically, exactly as you said, if you go down a laundry list of what Iranians on the streets right now in this pro-democracy movement want, I mean, it reads like the Bernie Sanders platform. Protection of the environment, LGBTQ rights, equality for women, equality for religious minorities and for other minorities in the country. Where is Bernie Sanders in this issue? Where is AOC? Where are these people? The hypocrisy is, I think, what frustrates and now has just jaded Iranians on this issue. We hosted an event almost a year ago now with a dissident who was inside the country, who's now unfortunately still in jail in the Islamic Republic, Abbas Vahedian Shahrudi. And he said, he came on the podium and said, look, the people of Iran, they have a very disfavorable view of the Democratic Party. Of course, that starts with Jimmy Carter coming to today. But it really is the hypocrisy, I think, which is so unfortunate, because the rhetoric on these issues is just above and beyond. But when it comes to the people of Iran, it seems that they don't think that Iranians deserve those same rights, especially when it's under a regime that is threatening our allies in the region, threatening U.S. national security. It just doesn't make sense. And the only conclusion that one is left to draw is that there's some ideological alignment between the folks here in Washington who are defending this regime and the regime itself. And really, I think the conclusion that we've reached is it boils down to this anti-imperialism, this anti-Americanism that's even embedded, unfortunately, in many politicians here. And that's sort of what guides them to be aligned with the Islamic Republic, or at least,
they share their hatred of the United States. I
Yes.
mean, that's what it is. They share the regime's hatred of the United States. And there are the Iranian people left, holding the bag,
And they're so clear. And on the streets of Iran, I alluded to some of their chants earlier. One of the most common chants that we hear in protests inside Iran, of course, it rhymes and sounds a bit better in Persian, but is...
What is it in Persian? What is it in Persian?
Dushman ma haminjas durug migan Amrikas, which means our enemy is right here. They lie when they say it's America. Because of course, for every problem the Islamic Republic blames the great Satan, blames the United States, and Iranians are literally responding to them on the streets, saying, no, America is not our enemy. We know that our enemy is the Islamic Republic, and we of course have even more symbolic pictures of the Iranian people's views. When I think we discussed this last time, you may recall a year or two ago, the Islamic Republic continuously in front of the entrances to university classrooms or government buildings will paint the American and Israeli flags on the ground to force people to step on the flag as a sign of disrespect and death to America. Iranians going in these buildings, they jump over the flags, they sort of hug the side of the building to refuse to step on the flag because they don't want to show a sign of disrespect to the United States or to Israel or to any other country. And this is another point that I wanted, if I could just briefly take the chance to talk about, is especially to our friends in the region, especially to our friends in Israel, in the Arab world, and even here in the United States, to say that, based on my understanding, of course, I'm not their spokesperson, but what I hear from the people of Iran, the distance that we talk, the people on the streets whose chants we're listening to and translating for a Western audience every day, unlike the government, the current government of the Islamic Republic, who is so full of hate and violence towards our friends in Israel, towards our Arab friends in the Persian Gulf and more broadly in the region, the people of Iran don't look at them that way. The people of Iran really want to be part of this progress that we're seeing across the region, be that in the Abraham Accords, be that the economic development that we're seeing, the growing closeness of these countries in the region. That's what the people of Iran want for their future. They just want a normal government, an Iranian government that thinks of their needs, that thinks of their economy, not at the expense of our neighbors, but in coalition with the neighbors in that part of the world. So I just wanted to take a chance, especially to our friends in the region, to say that hopefully one day when there's a different government in power, there's so many opportunities for collaboration, really to build a lasting peace. I fundamentally believe that change in Iran can really be the factor that puts the region on a progress to more peace and more stability for everyone who lives in the region. And until that happens, I unfortunately don't think that our friends in Israel, that our friends in Arab countries will have that peace, because the Islamic Republic until its last days will continue to fund Hezbollah, will continue to fund Hamas, will continue to fund Palestinian and Islamic Jihad, the Houthis, the Syrian regime, terrorist groups in Iraq. They're going to continue to do all of this. But when this regime is gone, the people of Iran have no interest in supporting terrorist groups that are killing Israelis, that are killing Iraqis, that are killing Syrians or Saudis or Emiratis. They want to focus on their own country and building their own country. And frankly, I'm quite hopeful for that day. But I just hope that our friends in the region also know that the Iranian people, they look at things so differently than this regime, and they really look to their neighbors as friends, not as enemies like this regime does.
So let me just ask you a couple more questions before we sign off for today. The first one is, Americans today and Israelis as well, I have to say, but they have this knee-jerk reaction that's understandable of anytime that you hear the term regime change, they turn green, because their experience, particularly in the United States, with trying to overthrow regimes and replace them with democracies in Iraq and in Afghanistan have been so horrible that, neuralgic was the term that I was looking for. They can't get their brains around it. If you watch Tucker Carlson, for instance, he definitely feels that anybody who wants to counter Iran's nuclear weapons program or in any way whatsoever confront the Iranian regime, that they're warmongers and they're pushing the United States into another unnecessary war. And, and he also, if we talk about the side that's willing to hear, about this problem, they're almost entirely on the Republican side of the aisle. And then you have very strong voices inside of the Republican Party, first and foremost, Tucker Carlson, just rejecting out of hand the concept that anything can be done in Iran. So, what is your response to people like that?
I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this because it's so important, whether it's people like Tucker Carlson, whether it's people on the left, they're sort of united in this disinformation campaign. Unfortunately, you're exactly
and
right.
Greenwald is his best friend on the left, right?
Exactly. And the first thing that I often say, and honestly, this is what we spend so much of our time doing, is explaining what our position is, and that's basically our responsibility to talk about this policy. The first thing that we say is when we talk about, first of all, we would call it supporting the Iranian people as the main way. When we talk about the change of regime in Iran, I would often just start with a basic question, which is, let's say you have a hypothetical regime. Let's take Iran out of the question. Let's say you have a hypothetical regime that is spending billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars to sow discord, terror, and fear amongst its neighbors by killing thousands, if not tens or hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians, be they in multiple countries in that region. That regime is also the main sponsor of international terror, and perhaps the foremost sponsor.
We won't call it Iran. We won't call it Iran. We don't. We're just making.
We won't call it. We won't just hypothetical country. And that regime is also committing crimes against humanity on a mass scale against its own people, and has probably killed hundreds of thousands of its own citizens. Should that regime change or no? And I think that most people would, of course, say yes, that regime should not be in power. And then, of course, we get to the trickier part, which is how should that be done? And that's where we often differentiate from the two most notable examples that you cited, Iraq and Afghanistan, and say very clearly from the beginning that in no way do we support US-led regime change. What we support is empowering and supporting and engaging with the people of Iran so that they can be the factors of change in their own country. There is so much historical precedent for this. It's just easy to discount it as warmongering or Iraq 2.0 or something. We saw in the Soviet Union, we saw throughout the Soviet bloc, we saw in South Africa how the international community can do two things. One, it can pressure dictatorships, and two, it can empower the people. President Reagan obviously was pressuring the Soviet Union, but he was also empowering Soviet dissidents like Natan Sharansky.
Right.
They were pressuring South Africa, but empowering the equality movement, the anti-apartheid movement there. So when we say the change of regime in Iran, it's not talking about U.S. paratroopers, floating into Tehran, and that's the last thing we would want. We don't think that another war is what's necessary. I think we can all agree on that. But it's supporting the Iranian people to achieve their own aspirations and hopefully reach a controlled implosion as opposed to some other military conflict. So that's the policy that we would outline. Indeed, we support certainly, hopefully in the next administration, a reimposition of maximum pressure on the Islamic Republic. We viewed that strategy as necessary but insufficient, and we would complement it by adding a second component, which we call maximum support of the Iranian people. And that can come in a variety of ways. In fact, that's the main project we're working on at the moment, which we hope will be a blueprint for U.S. policy in the next administration to immediately begin both these and not take as much time as it took in the previous administration. It can have several components. The first of which is the easiest, is just a communication strategy. Right now, for example, as people of Iran are on the streets protesting, the U.S. State Dar Farsi, the State Department's Persian language accounts, I kid you not, I wish I were joking, are posting about spin classes. In the previous administration, when there were protests in the street, President Trump was tweeting in Persian saying, "We support you." President Pompeo, Brian Hook were actively giving messages of support to the Iranian people. And you can discount that, some may, but for Iranians, I know it's maybe not so fashionable to say anymore, but the United States is a beacon of hope. It's a beacon for freedom. And when you have the President of the United States, the Secretary of State, the head of Iran policy, the spokesperson of the State Department, speaking up and standing with the people of Iran, that means a lot. So that's the first component, which is the easiest, doesn't cost $1. Then you can talk about other ways, for example, supporting the Iranian people to have internet access. As you well know, one of the main things the regime does is shut down the internet. There are ways, not just sort of the ways we all know about like Starlink, there are other ways to give the Iranian people access to the internet. There's also, for example, means of supporting laborers who want to go on strike. Of course, the right to form a union does not exist in Iran. Strikes are quickly broken by the regime. Having some form, for example, using the regime's frozen assets abroad to form a strike fund that could allow laborers to at least provide their families with an evening's meal when they're on strike, because the regime will, of course, immediately fire them and cut off their financial resources. So there are ways to empower the Iranian people to do this. And just to hit the nail on the head one last time, we had the pleasure of having an event with Secretary Pompeo last year, just a few weeks after you and I spoke, as a matter of fact. And the analogy
next time you got to invite me to one of these things. What does a girl got to do to get an invite around here?
So you'll be there for the next one for sure.
Okay.
We discussed it and we said, look, this is change in Iran is not something that the United States leads. It's something that the Iranian people lead, and they're the quarterbacks, and that the United States can help support and can help encourage and can help empower. The Iranian people are going to lead this. So this is very different from anything we saw in Iraq, anything we saw in Afghanistan. It's just sort of a cheap accusation, basically.
All right, and then the last thing, you were talking about satellite and Starlink, and I'm thinking, gee, somebody should talk to Elon Musk. See, maybe, I mean, he said he was going to do it for Ukraine, and he can get in touch with this guy. He's seeming more and more like a knight in shining armor with lots and lots of money. But maybe he can help with the internet, because my last question was, what can, we're looking at this in Israel, you're looking at this in the United States, we're looking at the enriched uranium piling up. What can just citizen activists do for the Iranian people? How is there anything that that we could do to help them? And just as normal middle class people living our lives, and we would like very much to help the Iranian people overthrow this regime.
Well, the first thing they could do, and I hope you'll forgive me for misusing this opportunity, is go to our website and help us with the donation. We're a very small organization. We try and do what we can. There's lots, in that.
And also share this show, subscribe to the Caroline Glick Middle East News Hour, and subscribe and send it out. And let's get the word out. So if you're doing a shameless self-promotion, then I'm going to do one too. Okay, so go to your website. They're subscribing to my channel. What else?
Perfect. That taught me, again, I thank you for having me on, because things like this really do help. Just talking about it, I think very often Iran is ignored. So, you say, what can an average person do? Just being a voice for the Iranian people really helps. Sharing videos from these protests, tweeting about this, talking about it with your, posting it on Facebook, things like that are really important, because when Iranians inside the country sense that they're alone, then they feel more scared. They feel as if, why are we risking if nobody's going to know what's happening? Nobody's going to come to support us. But when they have a sense that their cause is being talked about on the international stage, it really gives them a boost of confidence. And so it's so important. The other thing that I would say is that we can each, and this is obviously what we do as our job here at NUFDI, but what others can do in other countries is bring pressure on their own governments to talk about Iran. And this is the last point that I'd like to make, is whether or not you think that this regime should change in Iran, which I think we all agree it should.
Everybody watching the Caroline Glick Middle East News Hour, unless they're trolls, they agree.
Exactly.
They're self-selected. Yes.
You have an excellent audience in that case. But
I love my audience.
Let's put that normative question aside for a second. What I think that we need to be pressuring our governments, whether it's the Israeli government, whether it's those in the region or in the West, to think about is, again, whether one thinks this regime should go or not is a different question. But based on the events that we're seeing inside the country of Iran, the growing protests, the growing unity of the teachers with the retirees, with the students, with the farmers, everyone coming together, that should be raising some alarm bells or some red flags for analysts in these different governments, saying, even if we don't want this regime to collapse, it very well may, and we've got to be preparing for that as a matter of strategy for these countries. I think that what individuals can do is bring pressure on their own government, say, hey, are we prepared if this regime collapses tomorrow? And I think very often the answer to that question is no, that governments do not have a strategy for a post-Islamic Republic future. And so that's something very critical that everyday citizens, in addition to just talking about this issue on social media with their friends, we're lucky to live in, we're blessed, I should say, to live in countries which actually do have governments that at least in theory, should respond to their citizens, unlike the people of Iran. And we can use that to ask them, again, not just because we care about the Iranian people, which we do, but hey, as a citizen of the United States, as a citizen of Israel, are our countries ready for this possibility? Again, who's got a strategy? So I think pushing our governments to have strategies and be prepared for, at least be thinking about this, is critical as well.
All right. Well, Cameron, I think we're going to leave it at that. But I think that if there's one message that, I take from you is that, the Iranian people have been trounced, for 42 years by this. And initially, yeah, many of them liked it because they didn't know what it was. But as they got to know it better, they recognized that this isn't their government. This is a terrorist organization. And they're treated as one would expect to be treated if you're subject to the whims of a terrorist organization that has far greater aspirations than ruling you. You're nothing to them. What they care about is the revolution. Everything is about the revolution, and you're the cannon fodder of that revolution at best. So, it's all connected. If I say that, the Biden administration, the Democrat Party's refusal to help the Iranian people or recognize the danger from this regime is part and parcel of a growing anti-Americanism among Democrats, if they actually identify with America's enemies against the United States because they also hate America, then you have to understand that loving America, and preserving the United States, loving Israel, obviously, and preserving our country is also linked, in the case of Iran, to caring about the Iranian people, who really are brave and really are worthy of our support in and of themselves. And they're certainly, just when you look at it from a perspective of our own self-interest, of our own national interest, they also, we should really be rooting for them and doing everything that we can to help them.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better myself. And I very much appreciate the chance to be with you once again, and hope to see you again in person, whether here in Washington or in Israel, or who knows, maybe in Iran one day.
God willing, we'll see one another in all of those places, and first and foremost in a free Iran, and we can take a tour of the tombs of Mordechai and Esther together.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, listen, thank you guys very much. And no joke, check out NUFDI's site and see how you can help support their efforts, and go to CarolineGlick.com, go to, obviously, to jns.org and subscribe to my channels, my podcast, and the videos, and let's get this word out. Let's use our Facebook posts also to get the word out that the Iranian people are in open revolt and that we stand with them, and let our voices be heard on their behalf as well, because if they succeed, then we're all much, much safer. So thank you very much, and we will see you again next week. Bye, Cameron.
Bye, Carolyn.